Viewer discretion is advised. Chapter 5. Consciousness. It had been over 5 years since the nuclear crisis took place. Thomas and Seth, after discovering that they were the only ones left of their family, settled down in the town of Quartzsite and became good friends with the Meeks family. This behooved them, as Jack, being a former high-ranking officer in the Navy, had a vast arsenal of weaponry and other various militaristic devices. The ranch was also well-equipped with food, water, supplies, and a powerful backup generator suited for his bunker and charging his diversified collection of hardware for up to 20 years. Having said that, one does not need a mathematician to conclude that with the additional roommates, time with these luxury items would soon come to an end. Jack, having devoted most of his adult life to the military, spent the last several years training the four in weaponry and hand-to-hand combat. With his expertise on the government and with state-of-the-art communication devices at his disposal, they stayed abreast of the world around them. As they began to see the thinned U.S. military become overwhelmed by the Russian insurgents and the Mexican cartels, they came to grips with the reality of the increasingly violent world that America was becoming. There was something going on between the Russians and the cartels. Tensions flew high between the two. Although they seemed to hold a high level of animosity towards each other, they seemed to share a common goal: human trafficking. It wasn't clear to anyone who was benefiting from whom. All anyone knew was, when it came to the trade, the two worked closely together, hand in hand. This spurred the fire want to stick together and guard each other's backs. The four amateurs trained with Jack constantly. They trained in various military combat and were becoming very good at it. They had built themselves a very comfortable but lonely little community. The group all lived in Jack's farmhouse and took shifts keeping guard and completing supply runs. They were becoming a great team and worked well together. Over the years, the five became inseparable. The typical transient foraging for supplies slipped in and out of the town, but nothing thus far posed any threat to the well-defended family. There wasn't much Russian or cartel activity either in their sleepy little community. But that was beginning to change. They started noticing caravans of military vehicles traverse their surrounding offbeat roads and began to execute a more inconspicuous approach in their daily habits. The five began to do their supply runs under the cover of darkness. They established a stealthier approach at keeping guard over their property. They didn't have bonfires at night anymore and kept their extracurricular activities to a minimum. They became ghosts. They played it safe. They knew they could hold their own, but that didn't mean picking fights with large militarized insurgents or bloodthirsty kingpins. So, with this newly developed strategy, they gave themselves the best chance of survival. Still though, accidents do happen. In the dusty little abandoned town of La Paz, about 8 miles south of Quartzsite, Thomas and Seth were laying belly down on the roof of Gus's drive-through liquor. It was bright and sunny out, and not a cloud in the sky. They each held binoculars to their eyes and were peering over the 1-foot lip that crowned the rundown venue. Gus's liquor stood on an almost empty road. Once upon a time, this small brick building possessed prime real estate for catering to the weary worker wishing to dive into a glass bottle before calling it a night. Thomas, still peering through his binoculars, while next to his 17-year-old son, took his face away from them, stared blankly into the distance in front of him as he thought to himself. Then, he turned to Seth and asked, "So if something happens to me, or we all become separated?" But then, Seth stopped his dad while interrupting with an already prepared answer to his father's question, and answered in a tone of boredom. "Yes, Dad, I go and find Paco." Satisfied with a nod of his head, his dad went back to studying whatever it was they were watching through his binoculars. Then, once more, Thomas removed himself from the binoculars and again stared blankly into the distance as he thought to himself. He turned to Seth, but without even getting a word out, Seth was on top of it. "Yes, Dad," he said, while maintaining his focus on their target. Rio Baru Port, Dominical Beach, Costa Rica, like clockwork, at sunset on the 1st of every month. His dad smirked this time as he went back to join his son watching their objective. While still looking through the binoculars, Seth effortlessly composed a question. "We haven't seen Paco in years. How do you know he'll be there?" Thomas smiled. "He'll be there." "Okay, we got movement," Thomas calmly announced. They were now observing a small, dilapidated, abandoned warehouse across the street. In consort, 3 military-grade Hummers pulled up to the curb. 2 men in Russian military uniforms stepped out of each of them, their military boots all making contact with the asphalt below at the same time. It happened in an almost rehearsed, coordinated arrangement as they all came to one particular spot. The 4 from the 2 cars in the back approached the 2 that got out of the car in the front. The soldiers were all carrying rifles. They exchanged a few words in Russian and then opened the rear doors of the first Hummer. 3 people stumbled out. While hopping about, it was obvious they had been handcuffed and shackled. There was an older man and woman, then a young female standing behind them out of Thomas and Seth's view. As Seth and Thomas looked on in anticipation, they were eventually able to identify the female as the three were being motioned to begin walking. It was Beck. Thomas immediately voiced, "Got her." He then watched as they escorted the prisoners into the warehouse. There were 6 men altogether. 2 went inside with their hostages, and the other 4 stood guard by the doors, about 200 feet from where they had parked. Thomas lifted his head along with Seth, and they looked at each other. "You remember the plan?" Seth gave his dad a quick nod, and they both lowered flat to the ground and began army crawling backwards along the small rooftop. On the opposite side, at the rear of the building, they came to the ladder they had originally climbed to gain access to the roof. The ladder was fixed to the back of the building and led down to the pavement. They each shimmied over the ledge and down the ladder to the ground, Seth ahead of his father. Upon reaching the ground, Seth quietly opened and slid a large, heavy sewer cap from its place. Once completely open, he began to disappear down the dark hole. Meanwhile, Thomas carefully got into a very old, beat-up yellow Toyota Camry. The car was already running. They left it that way so they wouldn't have to start it up and bring any unwanted attention to themselves. He began to slowly drive off through an alleyway, keeping out of sight of their counterparts. A few moments later, another sewer cap began to move on its own, this time under the first parked Hummer. It was the only Hummer with a bed in the back. Once fully open, Seth slowly crawled from the hole. As he wiggled on his back across the beat-up and chipped asphalt, he made his way to the driver's side, opposite the armed Russians. He hefted himself up by first using the footrails of the massive vehicle. Then slowly reaching above, he gripped the open window's lower frame, ultimately scaling the entire side of the vehicle. Eventually, he found himself spilling into the driver's seat's black leather upholstery through the rolled-down opening. Once inside, hearing the sound of the vehicle's engine already running, he looked at the keys in the steering column with dismay. "Damn, I really wanted to try my hand at wiring one of these," he thought to himself. He placed his foot on the brake pedal and grabbed a hold of the steering wheel, taking a moment to enjoy the pure bliss of sitting in the driver's seat that commanded the 300-horse-powered monstrosity. He could barely hear the voices of the nearby Russians as they continued to obliviously carry on in conversation. Then, taking hold of the oversized shifter, he slid the powerful beast into neutral and revved the engine as loud as he could. The 4 exterior warehouse guards looked over at the truck, confused and shocked. Their postures shifted and their conversation became silent. Seth placed the vehicle into drive and made a piercing sound as he screeched out a sharp U-turn, kicking up a large fog of dust and dirt in the process. Now, his window, on the side where the caught-off guards were once casually speaking, he quickly achieved their surprised attention. With an extended left arm and middle finger reaching out the window, mocking the soldiers, he proceeded to speed off around the corner. "Later, fuckers," he yelled, tempting them to give chase. The 4 armed men in uniform began yelling in Russian as they ran down the parking lot to the street. They aimed their rifles and began firing, but soon realized their repossessed vehicle had already made its way around the corner. Listening to the direction the sounds were telling them to go, the men gathered a Hummer of their own and took off in pursuit. With surprising ease, the men chased down their enemy and soon found their lost item sitting on the steps of a church. Once parked behind their stolen vehicle, all 4 men quickly made their way out of their Hummer and surrounded the recovered car. They immediately discovered that no one was inside. All 4 began spinning their bodies and scanning the area, seeming to all draw their focus at the same time to the partially opened door of the church. They aimed their guns at the open door in front of them and began barking orders in Russian. As they made their way inside, they picked up a faint smell of gasoline. Looking at each other, the ranking officer signaled for the group to push on. The entry room was torn to shreds from previous lootings. It had thrashed, stained, red carpet, and white walls. As they moved their way through the meagerly sized foyer, they cautiously walked up to a set of double doors, which were slightly left open, leading to the chapel. A voice from within the chapel shouted, "You get your car back, assholes?" Not understanding the English words coming from inside in the room, they all recognized the voice from the thief that mocked them from before, while driving away in their Hummer. They slowly made their way in, guns drawn. The room was dark, with rays of light beaming through the boarded-up stained glass windows. Nothing about this seemed out of place to the men. They were used to no electricity, and this whole town was abandoned. What was out of place was the increasingly growing scent of gasoline. As they made their way into the room, toward the direction that they had heard the voice, they dutifully checked corners and the walls receding behind them. As they walked, sounds of broken glass and debris from under their boots filled the stuffy air. There were about 40 pews, 20 to either side of them, some knocked over, while some were out of sync with the rest. Soon, something caught their attention between the pews and near the steps leading to the pulpit. They trained their weapons on the object and advanced their positions while commanding orders in Russian. As they came up to the void, they saw the image come into focus. It was a large metal barrel. On top was a radio. The ranking officer picked up the device and flinched as a loud, crackly voice came over it.
Have fun, dickheads.
Still not understanding anything the voice was saying, the realization of a trap began to sink in and washed over their vacant expressions as they identified another object on the barrel. A car battery with wires coming out of it, leading to a hole inside the lid of the metal container. They quickly turned around and began to race for the door. The open double doors seemed to magically slam on their own, followed by the metallic sounds of several deadbolts taking their places from within. Then, without warning, several Molotov cocktails crashed through the glass and through the small breaches of the boarding. The men looked on in horror as the room became engulfed in flames, ending in a blast, providing a short rain of sand, ember, wood, and blood. Meanwhile, Jack and Trevor walked up to the now unguarded warehouse doors armed with small pistols. Jack looked at Trevor. "Ready?" Trevor nodded. Jack then pounded on the large metal sliding door. He then yelled in Russian with an impressive Russian accent, attempting to gain the attention of the hostage takers within the building. Then he stood back and let Trevor handle the next step. Immediately, the door to the warehouse slid open. Trevor yanked the man by the collar underneath his chin as Jack disarmed him of his weapon. Trevor swiftly changed his grip on the man from the man's collar to his arm, spun the man around and held his arm in a painful position high up his back behind him. Trevor then walked the man in, using his arm to steer him and his body as a human shield, while pointing his pistol at the soldier's temple. Trevor knew he had to stay focused on the task at hand, but he couldn't shake the urge to look for his missing sister. He momentarily took his eyes off the man he was walking toward, who was yelling at Trevor in Russian. It wasn't a big warehouse, about the size of a 3-car garage. Gray cement flooring spread throughout the structure, coalescing with the thin aluminum sidings. There was not much in the warehouse, a few tables, some bar stools, and whatnot. It was, however, well lit from the decrepit rooftop, allowing plenty of light to flow through, casting shadows along the walls and deep corners. The soldier across the room, once sitting on a chair next to a table monitoring a radio and still armed, was now standing, the chair he'd used knocked over behind him. He had his gun, which he had immediately taken off the table in front of him, upon noticing his abrupt threat, now pointed at his comrade, who was in the way of Trevor, his real target. But all he could see was Trevor's face, as Trevor strategically stayed behind his life like shield. The soldiers were both yelling in Russian, most likely ordering Trevor to surrender. He watched and kept his aim as Trevor kept advancing. Just then, he saw a man appear from behind Trevor. It was Jack. Then, this serious newcomer suddenly raised a small pistol from behind Trevor's back and shot a fire before he could react. As 2 gunshots sounded, a bullet went straight through his forehead as the man crashed to his knees and tumbled face first into the concrete floor. Almost at the same time, Trevor also dispatched his weapon, dropping the limp body from his clutches. With both men now fatally subdued, Trevor and Jack immediately scanned the room and found Beck lying on her stomach, hog-tied and muzzled, in between the other 2 prisoners. They were near the back of the warehouse in a dark corner. The pair of rescuers immediately liberated the 3 by cutting loose their bonds. Beck sprung into a hug with her grandfather. Later that evening, the reunited group drove through the dark summer's cooling heat. They were now heading north, back toward home. Seth, happily at the wheel, paid little attention to anything or anyone else, absorbing the emotions the truck incurred upon his male hormones. He made his turn onto the highway with his father at his side and had the look of utter enjoyment written across his face. In the back, a very relieved Gramps and brother sit close to Beck as they did their best to sensitively balance emotional support with interrogation. Then, Beck turned her head and peered into the seats behind her. "So, what's your names?" One of the other 2 rescued hostages spoke up with a little hesitation. "My name's Eugene. This is my wife, Anne." Anne and Beck began to laugh while sitting next to Delilah and Caleb amongst their modest picnic spread. The story of Beck's rescue mission and the fortunate events leading up to Eugene and Anne's freedom had always delighted the group. But no one told it the way Jack could. He always made everyone laugh when he described how Seth mocked the kidnappers. Joe didn't really get it as he sat next to Jack, staring resentfully into the distance. He was still annoyed at his unfortunate side of the so-called bargain the team had made with him. Delilah and Caleb didn't seem to care much either. Now was the time to focus on the real issues at hand, collecting the largest set of 4 in their card game. A lull came over the group's discussion as they reminisced upon old survival stories. Anne's smile faded softly. "I just wish we knew how they traced us back to your house. When we found Thomas the next morning, after his shift to keep watch." Her face grimaced as she could still vividly see Thomas hanging from the awning of the back porch, his stomach split open and his entrails splattered across the deck below him. The Arizona sunrise glowing behind him, creating an eerie juxtaposition. "I just don't get it. We never saw anyone follow us. Seth's never been the same since." "Of course, I don't blame him," Jack responded while pausing in thought. "You want to know something I still don't get? Why the hell didn't they finish us all off? At least we found Kent and his friends. Their brilliant plan with that gasoline generator really got us hell and gone from there. We were lucky that night for some strange reason, but I'm positive we were next on their shit-to-do list." Beck then added to the conversation, "I just wish we never heard that stupid broadcast. Fuck this place." Jack and Anne smiled in response. Then suddenly, a voice came over the radio that Jack was holding casually in his lap. It was Trevor. It was the first they'd heard from him since he descended down the elevator with Seth and Eugene. And unfortunately, he didn't have good news. He sounded rattled and spoke with a sense of hesitation, yet urgency. Houston, we have a problem. Over."